Central Texas, 1845. Nestled amongst the centuries-old oak trees and spring-fed creeks sits an idyllic farmstead. Its owners, likely immigrants from Germany, have meticulously built a small but sturdy cabin and maintained their crops and livestock herds through daily, arduous labor. Their efforts, however, have proven to be tragically in vain, as the entire family now lies prostrate and cold in various positions about the farmstead, the most recent victims of the Comanche raids that have been terrorizing the entirety of the Texas Hill Country for weeks now. This family has been targeted not because they have developed any personal animus between themselves and the Comanche, but because their mere presence here in what was known to the Spanish as Comancheria is tantamount to a declaration of war against the feared and fearsome lords of the southern plains. Their once bustling farmstead now lies still. The scene that unfolded only hours before must have been horrific, but it was not at all unique. The Comanche raiding party, quite large in this particular case, numbering between 200 to 300, had swept down from the surrounding hills, killed all who posed even the most tacit threat of resistance, and made off with all of the prisoners and horses that they were able to. Now, as the sun makes its ascent, burning off the morning mist and making the day stiflingly hot by noontime, the Comanche are on their way west. They have been traveling hard since their early morning raid on the farmstead. Their raiding has indeed proven successful, as they have gathered a large herd of horses stolen from several of the ranches surrounding the city of San Antonio. But the spoils of their effort are now proving to be a notable hindrance in their race to put distance between themselves and the Texans who would invariably pursue them. However, with the number of warriors present in this raiding party, the Comanche are not too concerned about the retaliation of a people who had proven all but inept in pursuing and engaging them. The Spanish had made their efforts in combating Comanche raiding, as had the Mexican government, as had virtually every sizable tribe in Texas. But at this point in 1845, with very few exceptions, the Comanche have operated with virtual impunity throughout the whole of Texas. They refer to the Texians and Mexicans as their livestock keepers, a people fit only to hold on to the vast horse herds until the Comanches see fit to take them. Their disdain for the settlers is certainly primarily due to their chosen location, as encroaching anywhere on the vast expanses of their rightful empire is an offense punishable by death. However, the Comanche also hold in contempt any culture, be it native or European-based, that practices sedentary agriculture. This is a decidedly distasteful livelihood by Comanche standards. They view their highly mobile hunting and raiding culture as a more masculine, honorable way of life, and therefore assumed it to be universally preferable. However limited their cultural viewpoint may be, their tactics and practices have proven highly effective. The Comanche's ascension from perpetually beleaguered hunter-gatherers to the wealthiest tribe on the whole of the American plains has been perhaps as rapid a transition as any society has undergone in human history. By the early 19th century, they have taken over virtually the entirety of the southern plains, from present-day Kansas all the way to South Texas. However, their wealth is not only in land, but in horses. Because of their geographic location at the southernmost point of the plains, the area that held the greatest concentration of settlements and of horses in the early 1800s, the Comanche were privy to the greatest selection of animals and the most opportunities to carry out raids. This led to the Comanche possessing far more horses than any other tribe. A typical young Comanche warrior might possess a herd of several dozen or even several hundred horses, a number comparable to even the wealthiest chiefs of more northerly tribes like the Sioux and Cheyenne. The economic importance of this advantage borders on incalculable, and the desire to maintain this advantage has left the Comanche with an unslakable thirst to continue adding to their collective and respective equine portfolios. Efforts to stop them, especially in the last few weeks, have proven maddeningly ineffective to both Texan farmers and government officials. As would happen several times throughout Texas history as Comanche attacks intensified, whole farmsteads were being abandoned by families in fear of becoming the next macabre recollection shared amongst terrified neighbors and townspeople. It seemed to many that, for all intents and purposes, there was no way to effectively combat a force who struck in lightning-quick raids and seemed to disappear into the western landscape just as quickly. The situation presented such a novel problem it seemed only a novel solution would suffice. In the decades prior, small forces under the directive of Secretary of State Stephen F. Austin had patrolled the ranges of the Texas frontier with the intention of finding and engaging the Comanche. It was hoped that a more offensive approach might dissuade further attacks. But the ranging companies, who would come to be known as the Texas Rangers, have managed to achieve only marginal success in tracking down and engaging the Comanche. They are perpetually underfunded, poorly equipped, and their ranks are made up of young men who largely have found no place in other parts of society. Most are men under the age of 25, who have come to Texas for the express purpose of violence and retribution. Every year, young men ride into San Antonio and eagerly sign on with the Rangers, boasting of all the Comanche scalps they are soon to take and of all the beautiful Texas maidens they would soon rescue. They would ride out of town at the first mention of a nearby Comanche attack, resplendent in all their martial glory, only to never be seen again. For the lucky among them, death would come quickly in battle, via the 14-foot Comanche lances and stocky, short arrows that whipped through the air with enough velocity to pass through the torso of a buffalo bull and stick into the hard prairie ground. For the unfortunate souls unlucky enough to be taken prisoner, their ends would not come so quickly. Many a young ranger would meet a prolonged, painful demise at the hands of Comanche torturers. For years, their success in pursuing Comanche raiding parties and preventing atrocities on the Texas frontier was a sporadic affair. Occasionally, they had been fortuitous enough to surprise a Comanche camp and rescue a captive or two, but they had continually struggled to match their adversaries in mobility and in the volume of fire they were able to amass. By 1845, however, this is beginning to change because of two critical factors now working in the Rangers' favor. The first is the advent of the Rangers' adoption of the Colt-Patterson revolver. Designed by New Jersey inventor Samuel Colt, the Colt-Patterson is the precursor to the 6-shot Colt Walker revolver that would come out 2 years later in 1847. Named after its inventor in his hometown of Paterson, New Jersey, the Colt-Patterson boasts a 5-shot cylinder and an imposingly large build. The 5 shots have to be loaded into the cylinder, and the cylinder would have to be detached to reload, necessitating that a ranger in the field keep several preloaded cylinders on his person. While it does not have the ease of use, capacity, nor firepower of its successor, the Colt-Patterson is a revolutionary weapon. However, years after its invention, the Colt-Patterson had been relegated to relative obscurity, as there was no military or law enforcement force who yet knew how to best employ the new weapon. Texas had first ordered 180 of the new revolvers from Colt, intending them for use by the new Republic's Navy. However, the Navy was never able to employ them to any meaningful ends, and thus the technology seemed destined for the proverbial scrap heap. However, before the Texas government gives up hope on the utility of the Colt-Patterson, they decide that perhaps the Rangers might be able to employ them. While this may seem an obvious conclusion to draw in hindsight, the notion of mounted gunmen attacking the Comanche in the same manner the Comanche attacked them was an essentially foreign notion. For centuries, as Americans had made their dogged advance eastward, combat against the native tribes of the eastern woodlands had involved fighting on foot. The terrain often did not lend itself to fighting from horseback. Furthermore, the rifles and muskets used by the Americans and their predecessors necessitated a lengthy, cumbersome reloading process that was next to impossible while riding atop a horse at full gallop. This gap in tactical prowess has allowed the Comanche to operate largely unfettered, as they are able to maneuver their mounts and unleash arrows at a rate the average Texan simply cannot match while footbound and firing sporadically from a single-shot weapon. But now, with the advent of a repeating weapon that can be fired multiple times before reloading and can be operated from horseback, the odds are becoming more favorable for the Rangers. But while the Rangers in general are a motley, combative lot, often prone to drunkenness and using coarse language, they have for too long lacked a leader with a clear, present vision on how to turn the tide against their Comanche foe. But in the last few years, a young Tennessean, with boyish looks and a seemingly unshakable demeanor, has been ascending the Ranger ranks. The progeny of a family with a long military tradition, he had come to Texas in the 1830s, narrowly missing his chance to serve in the Texas Revolution of 1836 and 37. He had, instead, taken up work as part of a surveyor party, perhaps the most dangerous job in Texas at the time. The Comanche were well aware of surveyor parties, and had surmised that their purpose was to measure out the allotments of their land that the Texas government was unjustly giving away. Thus, surveillance parties were subject to some of the most gruesome tortures the Comanche practiced, from being staked out alive on the plains, to be eaten by wild animals and burned by the sun, to heaping hot coals upon the unfortunate victim's torso. He had managed to avoid such unfortunate fates and was able to sign on with the Texas Rangers. For the last several years, he has been working his way through the Rangers' ranks. His name is John Coffee Hayes, better known as Jack Hayes. He will prove to be the second important factor in changing the way the Rangers fight. In a world of the big-bodied ruffians that comprise most of the Ranger forces, Hayes stands out for both his slender build and his civilized manners. He has a calm, high-toned voice, dark hair, and the cool, calculating eyes of a dyed-in-the-wool killer. Time and time again over the preceding years, the Rangers in Hayes' company have marveled at his ability to switch instantaneously from an affable, thoughtful conversationalist to a snarling, myopically focused combat leader. The times he has put himself in mortal danger from enemy fire, all while doling out concise, clear orders to the Rangers in his command, seem too numerous to count by this point in his career. For months now, Hayes and his Rangers have been in San Antonio, setting off occasionally to patrol the surrounding territory and training incessantly with their new revolvers. Time and again, each Ranger rides through an obstacle course of sorts while firing at targets set on fence posts. Hayes drills the men until not only they, but their horses are fully comfortable with the demands of combat conducted on horseback. Some of the Rangers gripe quietly that they are tired of the incessant drilling, but all of them know the time for them to employ their skills is close at hand. That time finally comes late in the afternoon of the day the unfortunate homesteaders are killed. Hayes receives word that, yet again, the Comanches have wrought their particular brand of havoc on the surrounding countryside. He is informed that the impending raiding party is on their way west, towards the Frio River. Within minutes, Hayes and a party of 42 Rangers have assembled at the western edge of the city of San Antonio. Hayes briefs them on the specifics of the route he intends to take and informs the men, much to their satisfaction, that their intent is to catch up with the Comanche, kill as many as possible, and recover the horses they have stolen. The Rangers ride hard, knowing that with the small size of their force and the Comanche's cumbersome number of warriors and horses, they can very well catch up to the Comanche before they are able to disperse onto the vast expanses of West Texas. Riding with them, as is often the case, is a native scout. He is a Lipan Apache chief named Flacco, and he may be the linchpin to this entire Ranger operation. Chief Flacco has grown up combating the Comanche, as they were, at least for varying periods of the 19th century, mortal enemies to his tribe. He has stayed in and around San Antonio for the last several years, and by this time has built a strong friendship with Jack Hayes. The two men, both warriors and leaders of men, have an immense, enduring respect for each other. It is Chief Flacco who has encouraged Hayes to fight the Comanche on their own terms. Now, his tracking ability, far more honed and refined than even the most astute Rangers, will make the critical difference in whether the Rangers will even find the Comanche raiding party. After traveling roughly 60 miles, though, the entire party can sense that the Comanche are close. Finally, as they come within sight of the Frio River, the Rangers spot the Comanche. Seemingly simultaneously, the Comanche spot them. Thinking a force of several dozen to be no match for their force of 200 to 300, the Comanche form a battle line between the Rangers and the horses and prepare to receive a Ranger attack. For their part, the Rangers know that there is not a second to lose. They have trained to engage the Comanche on the Comanche's terms, and this meant that the time to launch a full-scale, head-on attack was now. At the time the two parties see each other, Hayes is riding on a mule towards the rear of the Ranger column. Now aware of the urgency of an immediate attack, Hayes spurs his mount forward as fast as possible. On his way towards the front, he comes upon another Ranger on a fine horse who looks to be reining his mount in order to keep him from charging forward at full speed. Hayes calls out to the man to hurry forward, but the Ranger insists that the horse is trying to run away with him, and it is all he can do to keep the horse from galloping away completely uncontrolled. Hayes, in a rush to get to the front of the column and dubious of the man's claims, insists that they switch mounts. The Ranger takes over the mule while Hayes jumps astride the skittish horse. Almost at the instant Hayes touches down in the saddle, the horse is off in a full sprint towards the front, paying no heed to the directives of the range, the stirrups, nor Hayes' shouts. The front of the column, with their revolvers drawn and teeth bared, are now charging forward towards the Comanche line. In the lead, eager to engage the Comanche, is Chief Flacco. As he rides, he sees Hayes fly by, riding at full speed past the front of the Ranger column. He has no idea that Hayes is aboard a runaway horse and assumes that his friend's near-suicidal penchant for bravery in combat has reached a new, inexplicable, and ill-advised level. The chief, a proud warrior himself, decides in an instant that he will not let his friend ride off to certain death alone, nor will he let a Texan steal all the glory in combat against his hated enemy. Chief Flacco urges his horse on, faster and faster, until it is just himself and Hayes between the charging Rangers to their rear and the 200 to 300 strong column of Comanche warriors to their front. Both men, now committed to the attack, begin to fire their revolvers as the ground rapidly closes between themselves and the Comanche. To the Rangers riding behind them, this charge the two men have undertaken seems suicidal. Death, for both men, despite their gallantry, seems imminent. But the Comanche are so astounded by the reckless bravery of the charge, they suffer a momentary bout of paralysis by analysis, unsure of what exactly is happening. This brief lapse in vigilance means that Hayes and Flacco, instead of crashing into a hail of bullets and arrows, merely rush through the lines of their adversaries. The Rangers, still charging in a force 41 strong towards the Comanche, seize the opportunity presented by a confounded enemy and pour fire into the Comanche ranks. Much in the fashion of the Comanche, they make several whirlwind attacks, striking the Comanche lines and then retracting before striking again. Hayes and Flacco are able to flank the Comanche and make their way back to the Ranger forces in time to inflict casualties of their own against the warriors. The Comanche put up a hellacious fight for a time, but are overwhelmed by the volume of fire this small contingent is able to inflict upon them. Finally, the Comanche break ranks, and in the words of J.W. Wilbarger in his 1889 work, Indian Depredations in Texas, a panic at length seized them, and they fled and scattered in every direction. After the fight, as many horses as can be recovered are rounded up, and the party returns to San Antonio. Chief Flacco, in part astonished by his friend's bravery and in part amused that the charge had been the result of a panicked horse, bestowed a lasting nickname upon the captain that would be known to his friends and enemies alike. From that day on the Frio River ford, Captain Hayes will be known to many in Texas as Bravo Too Much or Brave Too Much. The name certainly has a tinge of good-natured ribbing between friends, but its meaning is also starkly serious and, as time will prove again and again, inarguably apt. Chief Flacco and Jack Hayes will go on to many more fights against the Comanche, and Hayes will carve out his own brutal legacy in the battlefields of the Mexican-American War from 1846 to 1847. He will eventually move to California with the advent of the 1849 gold rush, and the two old friends will never see each other again. Flacco would go on to become a legendary figure in Texas history whose story deserves an episode all its own. But the bloody war for control of Texas is not over. It will in fact carry on for decades more and see countless lives lost on both sides, and ultimately, the end of the Comanche's way of life. But the innumerable accounts of the heroics and villainy wrought by Texans and Comanches alike are, for tonight, other stories for other times. Central Texas, January 23, 1871. Amidst the rolling landscape that surrounds them, on an isolated strip of cattle trail, 3 working cowboys ride west from the town of Weatherford. They are on their way to the ranch of Britt Johnson, better known as Britt Johnson, who rides at the head of the group. They intend to gather Johnson's cattle and make a return trip to sell them in Weatherford. With Johnson are Dennis Cureton and Paint Crawford. All 3 men are known and respected locally for their skill as cowhands and their dealings in business. They are all also ex-slaves, officially made American citizens and given their freedom less than a decade earlier. However, despite the tenuous state of the nation in the Reconstruction era, Britt Johnson has built a reputation amongst all peoples of the area as a forthright and upstanding citizen, as well as a local hero. 7 years prior, in the summer of 1864, while still under the bonds of slavery, Johnson had been commissioned by his then master to travel to nearby Parker County to procure supplies for the ranch. Britt Johnson had left his wife and young children with the Fitzpatrick family, trusting that they would be safe from the incessant Comanche and Kiowa raiding that plagued the area at the time. Upon his return, Johnson was met with the horrifying news that the small neighborhood he and his family called home had been laid waste to. His son, Jim, and several members of the Fitzpatrick family had been murdered, and the rest of his family had been kidnapped by Comanche and Kiowa raiders. He had secured written permission from his then master to travel alone on the frontier, a legal necessity at the time, and then ventured out on his own in search of not only his family, but the surviving members of the white Fitzpatrick family as well. After months of tracking and subsequently working his way into the good graces of the tribes, Johnson had been able to negotiate trades for the return of not only his family, but all of the surviving members that had been taken in what came to be known to history as the Elm Creek Raid. Some members of the tribes, though, regarded his dealings as being underhanded and self-interested, as he had reportedly absconded with more rescued captives than the Kiowa and Comanche had agreed to. Thus, some warriors of both tribes vowed that, should the opportunity ever arise, they would take their retribution on Britt Johnson. Now, 7 years later, Johnson pulls his large horse to a halt, as the men set out to make camp for the night. The trusted steed has been with him since before he ventured out alone in search of his family, and is not only a trusted workmate, but a treasured companion. Scampering around the horse's feet, Johnson's small dog greets his owner as he steps from his saddle to the ground, whimpering and excitedly wagging his tail. Though the scene might appear akin to that of a relatively placid modern-day trail ride, the situation at hand is anything but. Though considerable time has passed since the Elm Creek Raid, hostilities between settlers on the Texas frontier and the mighty Comanche and Kiowa tribes still rage, and any territory between towns and homesteads is considered to be dangerous ground for travelers. All three men, though, are seasoned hands at both working cattle and fighting hostile native tribes. Thus, they carry about their work of setting up camp for the night with a workmanlike deliberation that, to the outside observer, seems wholly untroubled by the potential danger at hand. However, all three men are also heavily armed with repeating rifles and Colt revolvers, a necessity in this territory. They also carry hundreds of rounds of ammunition. As the men finish making camp and prepare to bed down for the evening, they notice another group of working cowhands hauling freight to Weatherford, camped roughly a mile and a half away. Thinking themselves to be relatively safe for the night, the men soon drift off to sleep after consuming a cold supper. The next morning, January 24th, arrives with the typical merciless chill that plagues the country throughout the winter. As the morning sun begins to peek over the horizon, Britt Johnson, Dennis Curtin, and Paint Crawford rise and begin to prepare themselves and their horses to move on for the day. However, just as their thoughts begin to drift to preparing breakfast and what the day's travel might hold, the three men in the small camp are startled by the sickening sound of thunderous hoofbeats cutting through the morning stillness. Looking in the direction of the sound, the three men see an oncoming cloud of 25 Kiowa warriors, bearing down upon their encampment at full speed. The Kiowa are in the area conducting raiding on local homesteads when they have spotted Britt Johnson and company the day prior. Seeking to make good on their old promise of settling their score with Johnson, they now charge upon the camp in full regalia, their war whoops intermittently piercing through the thunderous cacophony of their horses' hoofbeats. Though a completely separate and much smaller tribe than their allies in the Comanche, the Kiowa are just as renowned in this territory for their bravery, horsemanship, and ruthlessness. While the Comanche are known for their Spartan-like ornamentation, though that has begun to change in the latter 19th century, the Kiowa possess a far more complex cultural tapestry of dress, religion, economics, and social structure. The Kiowa that now charge upon the camp are more ornately dressed than their Comanche counterparts, but their tactics, ones familiar to Johnson, Curtin, and Crawford, are drawn from the same well of knowledge and experience drawn upon by the Comanche, as well as other Plains tribes. Rather than a head-on charge at the cowhands' campsite, the warriors maneuver forward in a whirling cyclone, in which the rider nearest the target fires his shot, before continuing on to the back of the circle to reload and return for another shot. The whirlwind of bullets and arrows soon encircles the entirety of the small three-man camp, which provides no cover to its inhabitants. Now, the once placid campsite is engulfed in the storm of violence, as all three men scramble for any semblance of cover they can find. They pour fire from their rifles into the thick oncoming Kiowa formation, loosing dozens of rounds in little more than a few minutes. However, essentially caught in the open, Cureton and Crawford are quickly cut down by Kiowa bullets and arrows. With no other options at hand, Britt Johnson draws the large bowie knife he keeps in a scabbard on his belt and, after a heart-wrenching few milliseconds, dispatches his beloved horse with the large steel blade. The hulking animal falls where it had stood, and Johnson takes what sparse cover he can find behind the animal's corpse. Now, aside from his small dog, Britt Johnson is the only remaining member of the camp left alive. From their vantage point roughly a mile and a half away, the team of ranch hands hauling freight to Weatherford can only watch as the fight unfolds, afraid of drawing the much larger Kiowa force's ire upon themselves. They watch, awestruck, as Britt Johnson now fights for his very life in a battle that he very likely knows is lost. However, Johnson fights on with the fury of a man possessed. In a momentary lull in the attack, he scrambles to the bodies of his comrades and procures their firearms and ammunition, before retaking his position behind the body of his horse and continuing to pour fire into the ranks of the Kiowa. With seemingly robotic efficiency, Johnson continues to fire and reload, methodically picking off his attackers as the relentless succession of charges continues. No one can know what thoughts crossed the mind of Britt Johnson during these lonesome, fearful moments. It is a safe assumption, however, that the memories of his beloved wife and children, now only a few dozen miles away, flood his mind. So too might have the memories of his time with the tribes, the killing of his son, and the promises of the disaffected warriors to exact their revenge. Though no one can know his thoughts in his final minutes, Britt Johnson's actions now become the stuff of Texas legend. As the Kiowa warriors dart around him like a swarm of enraged hornets, Johnson gives no quarter and asks for none. Shot after shot rings out, deafening all within earshot as the ground seems to quake with the rumble of the horse's hooves. Finally, though by what means we are unsure, Britt Johnson is struck by either a bullet or an arrow and dealt a mortal wound. Though the onlooking men of the freight hauling detail are unable to discern the moment at which Johnson is killed, they witness the Kiowa swarm his position and know that all is lost for the brave lone cowboy. Hours later, they venture forth to the site of the battle, assured the Kiowa have now left the area. What they find bespeaks a fight and an aftermath that, even on the bleeding edge of the Texas frontier, was unique in both its brutality and its ruthlessness. They find the bodies of Dennis Cureton and Paint Crawford where they had fallen, the tops of both their heads freshly scalped. They see the body of Johnson's horse, prostrate in its last act of service, riddled with bullets and pincushioned with arrows. Behind the body of the horse, they find Britt Johnson. He has been terribly mutilated, with his face gruesomely disfigured, scalped, and eviscerated. So, too, has the body of his small but eternally faithful dog, found shoved into Johnson's torso. However, in a testament to Johnson's commitment to fight until the end, 173 cartridges are found scattered around his body. To the men investigating the site, and in the eye of posterity, this is a near unbelievable amount of firepower for one man to have unleashed during a fight that was all but assuredly lost before it even began. In the end, the bodies of Britt Johnson, Dennis Cureton, and Paint Crawford are buried in a common grave next to the road near which they fell. A small marker with all three of their names is left at the spot, which is today marked by an official Texas Historic Site marker. Though he was not afforded a major affair for a funeral, and was meant to suffer some of the worst indignities wrought upon American citizens within its tumultuous history. Britt Johnson is remembered as a Texas legend and an example to all of what selflessness, determination, and bravery really mean. For their part, the Kiowa would go on to retreat to the northwest, to the vast open plains. Here, they would again join forces with the Comanche in the ensuing 4 years in what would come to be known to history as the Red River War. This war would ultimately spell the beginning of the end for both the Kiowa and the Comanche, two powerful tribes that had been ravaged for decades by warfare and disease. But the many tales of the Red River War, as well as the full story of Britt Johnson's one-man ventures to reclaim his family, are, for tonight, other stories for other times. San Antonio, Texas, springtime 1756. In the bustling city, then a part of the Spanish Empire and known as Behar, members of the native tribes of central and northern Texas began to pour into the city in what was beginning to look like a mass exodus southward. Most preeminent among these tribes were the Apache, with whom the Spanish had battled for centuries now in repeated attempts at what they called reduction, meaning the assimilation of the native peoples into the Catholic faith in Spanish society and an eventual rejection of their own traditions. The Apache had thus far been less than receptive. They ran Texas, and the Spanish, with their adobe missions and brown-robed friars and armor-clad dragoons, amounted to little more than intruders in their eyes. They had reached a truce in 1744, but it had been more of a cessation of battle than an agreement on territory. But now, the local priests were inundating their government officials with letters beseeching them to fund more missions, pushing north into Texas at the request of the Apache. So what happened? Did they have a sudden change of heart? No, not at all. See, what the Apache wanted was a buffer zone, something to take the brunt of the attacks and raiding that was continually being wrought upon them by a tribe they called the Norteños, because they always came from the north. And when they did, they brought death and destruction to anyone and anything in their wake. The Spanish knew about their intertribal warfare, but like every other European power occupying the continent, they didn't truly understand it. And as much of it was occurring beyond the timberline and rolling limestone hills of the Texas Hill Country, they were not privy to all the gruesome details of what amounted, in many respects, to a wholesale slaughter of the Apache people. Even on the plains, where complete and total warfare, meaning the killing and capturing of women and children, was the norm, this was a particularly shocking level of violence. All signs pointed to the building of new missions in this disputed and dangerous territory as being a bad idea. But one man, Father Alonso Toreros, had a vision. The establishment of a mission system in Texas would be his gift to the world, and his place in history, in turn, would be the world's gift to him. Father Toreros' cousin, the wealthy mine owner, the illustrious Knight Don Pedro Toreros of the Order of Calatrava, backed him both financially and politically, also in hopes of cementing the Toreros name forever in posterity. After much back and forth, it was determined that the new mission would be established along the San Saba River, along with a presidio or military fort to provide protection from hostiles. However, the presidio would be constructed at a bend in the river roughly 4 miles away from the mission itself. This too was at the request of Father Toreros. He figured the last thing he wanted was a bunch of drunk, armed, and armored soldiers creating tension and causing chaos with the tribespeople he was attempting to bring into the proverbial fold. But as far as actual protection from the attacks went, 4 miles was a lot of ground to cover, and the soldiers wouldn't prove much immediate help, if any help at all, should the mission be in real trouble. And attacks were happening all over the territory, and they had been for years, and tribes that had once been formidable foes were now simply gone, having either been killed, relocated, or assimilated into other tribes. The Norteños were running wild all over the southern plains, having mastered the art of horsemanship like none other. And with their mobility and ferocity, they soon controlled basically all of Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, New Mexico, and Colorado. They struck under the light of full moons and could cover hundreds of miles on horseback in any direction. And they hated the Apache. What they were attempting was not to beat the Apache in a war for territory or even subjugate the Apache. They wanted to eradicate the Apache. And thus, the Apache became quite friendly to the Spanish missionaries and soldiers, whom they hoped might afford them some level of protection or at least serve as meat for the grinder while they made their getaway south. Still, Father Toreros persisted in his vision, and the mission was built in April of 1757 near the present-day town of Menard, Texas. It was mostly an adobe and timber structure with timbered walls surrounding its perimeter. It was certainly a modest structure, even considering the austere conditions in which it was built. The military commander of the presidio, Colonel Padilla, had fought this poorly planned and ill-conceived venture from the start. He knew the tribes, knew the territory, and insisted that this foolhardy and very likely mortally dangerous behavior was not going to end well. And he also knew the violence that was being wrought. He had seen it up close and personal, and knew that this humble little mission, staffed by a few Spanish priests and their few native converts, amounted to a declaration of war. But his words fell on deaf ears, as expansion and legacy in the name of conversion, of course, were what mattered, not the quibbling of what the Spanish crown saw as the regional heathen hordes. More warnings came, increasingly ominous. Throughout the summer and fall of 1757, with the Apache who passed through warning of a coming attack from their dreaded foes, the Norteños. But still, Toreros persisted. All the while, as his priests began to hear of the brutality of these attacks, of black-clad, black-painted, buffalo-horned demons who carried lances twice as long as a man was tall and could let loose an arrow every 3 seconds from atop a highly trained and specially bred warhorse, he dismissed them as tall tales, exaggerations of what would amount to a minimal challenge in defeating and subjugating these Norteños, or, as history would come to remember them, the Comanche. But the Comanche were not a tribe to be subjugated. They were, in fact, what amounted to an empire that, all things considered, controlled more territory on the North American continent than any European power could make any legitimate claim to at the time. And the establishment of the San Saba Mission and its presidio enraged them. As this became more and more apparent, more priests left, and most all complained of the futility and danger they were facing in the name of little to no gain, either for God or country. The soldiers in the nearby presidio became more and more restless, as did Padilla, who knew all too well the trouble that was coming. The trouble came on March 16, 1758. The previous few mornings, Father Toreros and the mission inhabitants had risen to a smoldering Texas sunrise, with dew on the grass and mesquite trees all around, birds chirping, cattle stirring, and bluebonnets all around. As remote and austere as it may have been, it was a beautiful, enchanting place. 2 weeks prior, the mission had been raided of nearly all of its horses, and all of the Apache who had been staying in the mission, sensing danger close, left in a haste. Padilla had sent out a small group of soldiers in pursuit of the Comanche horse thieves, but they returned in a hurry, reporting that the Comanche were everywhere. How many, they could not be sure, but there were a lot of them, and they were pissed. Now, 2 weeks later, Father Toreros woke not to a warming sunrise, but to cold, stark terror. Birds did not chirp. Cattle did not stir. Instead, an eerie silence hung over that early morning as Toreros was alerted to the fact that, after nearly a year of warning, the storm from the north had arrived. As Father Toreros approached the walls of the mission, and peeked over. Silhouetted in the pre-dawn hue were 2,000 horseback warriors. They were a conglomeration of tribes, as often happened, with members of the Caddo and Wichita tribes present, but mostly what Father Toreros and his terrified brethren now saw surrounding their mission was thousands of Comanche, notoriously shorter and stouter than their northern plains counterparts, smeared with black because it was the color of death. They wore no feathers, no beads, no ornamentation other than the occasional buffalo horn headdress. They were equipped with a few muskets, along with their bows, arrows, and lances. Their horses were small and rugged-looking, unshod and without saddle. Their breath hung heavy in the morning air. The Comanche were here, and now there would be hell to pay. At first, there was an awkward, feigned peace, a stomach-churning handful of moments in which hope may have seemed possible. The presiding chief rode into the mission and accepted tidings of greetings and even a few small trinkets as gifts. But then, suddenly, though not unexpectedly, the killing started. First to die was Father Toreros. A musket shot killed him at the outset of the violence, and considering what was to come, he was lucky. The other priests were summarily shot and hacked down, their freshly slaughtered corpses immediately stripped and cut to pieces. An account of one survivor remembers the priests kneeling and praying in full resignation to their fate, patiently awaiting their inevitable martyrdom. One by one, all of their skulls would be split open and their bodies mutilated beyond recognition. Fires would be set to buildings. Smoke encapsulated the area. As fires raged and blood covered the ground, gradually sinking into the dust. One of the few priests left alive, Padre San Sebastian, fled to the mission chapel in a fleeting attempt at saving the tabernacle. He was stabbed several times, and then his head was laboriously sawed off by a Comanche hunting knife. Where only an hour earlier, residents of the mission had lined up and knelt to receive Holy Communion, one now had to watch their step, lest they slip in the thick, viscous layer of blood and brain matter now coating the floor. 20 residents and one priest managed to take refuge in a small building as an orgy of death and dying continued around them. Every single one of the cattle and livestock kept by the mission was slaughtered and every building ransacked. Meanwhile, seeing the attack from the presidio, Colonel Padilla sent out a small contingent of soldiers, but kept the majority there to protect the more than 300 women and children who lived at the presidio. Out of the 8 soldiers sent out, 2 were immediately killed, and every single one was at least hit with one arrow or stabbed with a lance. It's a tough day. They never even got close to the mission. They scurried back into the protection of the presidio, and with the rest of the inhabitants, watched and waited as the destruction of the mission continued. They would end up watching and waiting for 3 days. The inhabitants hiding in the small building managed to slip away to the presidio as well, but all the rest, 10 people in total, including 3 priests, were left at the mission, cut into pieces, their eyes cut out, tongues cut out, genitals cut off, eviscerated, then scalped. A scene that would become all too typical on the Texas frontier. Immediately following the attack, the colonel petitioned for more soldiers and support and made a feeble and underfunded attempt at tracking down the attackers and exacting revenge. But it was not to be. The Norteños, true to form, had wrought destruction on all who opposed their power and disappeared again into the north. Father Torero's wealthy cousin had a painting commissioned in 1758 titled Massacre at the San Saba Mission, and it is in fact the oldest representation of a historic event in Texas, one befitting the Lone Star State's uniquely wild and bloody history. It depicts the events of that day in a clockwise fashion around a larger portrait of the mission itself. If you know the story behind it, you can almost feel the heat from the flames emanating from the brushstrokes, as if you were there on that lonely Texas prairie so many years ago, as the screams faded and the smoke rose. Fort Colorado, Texas, late March 1837. As a full moon illuminates the hill country and prairie lands that surround them, a small contingent of Texas Rangers while away the cool spring evening, ensconced in conversation, card games, and the whine of the fiddle being played by Ranger Noah Smithwick. The more senior veterans of this ad hoc frontier force regaled their younger comrades with stories of past fights with, and narrow escapes from, the fearsome, venerable Comanche. The Rangers' very existence and their presence at this fort located in what is now southeast Austin is the product of Texas's ongoing fight against the ruling lords of the Southern Plains. The Comanche have spent the previous century clearing nearly the whole of Texas of any peoples who sought to oppose their claim to these valuable lands. It had first been the Apache, then the Spanish, then the Mexicans, who had suffered the brunt of Comanche raiding and warfare. Innumerable times, in just the preceding few years, entire families had been laid waste. The men killed outright were subjected to vicious torture killings. The women and children taken prisoner and oftentimes either killed themselves or subjugated to a life of slavery. The Comanche, once a downtrodden people, relegated to the hinterlands of the northern Rockies, had risen to prominence with the acquisition of the horse in the 17th century. Though many tribes had been the beneficiaries of the diaspora of horses onto the open plains following the Pueblo Revolt of 1680, it was the Comanche in particular who had taken to the animal with a seemingly intrinsic, inexplicable ease. Their penchant for horsemanship and capabilities as a mounted raiding and warfare machine had rapidly become the stuff of gruesome folklore across all of Texas. And for generations now, military forces, including the likes of the Spanish and Mexican army, had tried, and failed, to stem the tide of Comanche violence. The Texas Rangers had been officially formed in 1823 by Stephen F. Austin, eventual namesake to the now capital city, in hopes that the ranging companies could provide both a territorial patrol and a sort of quick reaction force to respond to raiding in the area. In the ensuing 14 years, the Rangers had met with varying degrees of success, and faced numerous setbacks and challenges in regards to both manning and arming their forces. At this point in 1837, just after the Texas Revolution, the entirety of the Texas frontier comprises the very bleeding edge of westward expansion from America. The pay for a prospective ranger is low, and the likelihood of a grisly demise at the hands of his enemy is comparatively high. They are armed with single-shot rifles and pistols against an enemy capable of unleashing several arrows a minute from a rapidly oncoming cavalry charge. Still, though they have at times seen casualty rates as high as 50%, the Rangers have proven thus far to be the only consistent, even marginally effective force against the Comanche. Still, these men inside Fort Colorado largely count themselves fortunate to have found such a vigorous, violent profession. However, on this night, most of them have resigned themselves to a restful, placid evening. But just as some of the men are about to turn in for the night, one of the Rangers on guard duty spots the flickering light of a campfire a few miles west up the Colorado River, on a high knoll overlooking a popular crossing spot near today's Lamar Boulevard. This is, to say the least, an unusual sighting. In such hostile territory, travelers of any kind, be they native, Texan, American, or Mexican, generally avoided illuminating their positions with campfires. Doing so was, oftentimes, inviting an ambush from the dreaded Comanche. However, as the ranger studies the spectacle longer, he begins to see shadowy figures, dancing back and forth in the flicker of the light. He reports his findings, and many among the men concur that the only party of warriors who would be so bold as to strike a campfire in the middle of Comanche territory would be the Comanche themselves. Even from afar, it is clear that this band of warriors is unconcerned with their own safety, believing themselves to be all but untouchable inside the confines of their rightful domain. Now, the conversation amongst the Rangers shifts to whether or not an immediate attack should be made. The officer in charge, a veteran ranger by the name of Captain Andrews, confers with some of the other veterans, all of whom argue for advancing upon the Comanche immediately. Charged with the safety and well-being of his men, however, Captain Andrews is momentarily reluctant to order his men outside the walls of the fort, considering the risk of a night movement and surprise attack on an enemy force of unknown strength. His veteran rangers, however, offer a simple and straightforward solution to this quandary by insisting that Captain Andrews need only ask for volunteers. Seeing this as a suitable compromise, Captain Andrews asks for volunteers and is roundly met with several rangers ready to depart at once. These men double-check their weapons, load themselves with as much lead shot and gunpowder as they can carry, and mount their trusted war horses before riding out of the gates and into the dark of the hill country night. Leading the volunteers is 2nd Lieutenant Wren, another veteran ranger. In total, there are 15 rangers now making their way through this precarious country under the cover of night. Adding to the ominous affair of this occasion, storm clouds soon roll in, further darkening the night sky. As they near the site of the Comanche camp, Lieutenant Wren, Ranger Joe Weeks, and Ranger Noah Smithwick advance ahead of the rest of the ranger contingent to reconnoiter the area ahead. This task, simple enough on its face, becomes an hours-long endeavor that consumes the remainder of the night, as the rangers literally inch forward on their bellies through the brush and tall grass towards the Comanche camp. Finally, as the sun begins to crest the eastern horizon, the rangers find themselves in plain view of the Comanche camp. However, their trajectory has placed them far closer to the Comanche's horse herd than they had initially planned. For a tense few moments, the rangers hold their collective breath, as it seems all but certain that the remuda of Comanche horses and mules will be spooked by their presence, inevitably alerting their owners. But, miraculously, the animals continue grazing, seemingly unfazed by the rangers' presence. Scanning the campsite, the rangers are astonished to see sleeping Comanches strewn out upon the ground, seemingly sleeping off a long night of revelry. Now, having remained undetected and having avoided potential calamity, Wren, Weeks, and Smithwick make a much more hastened crawl backwards, rejoining their comrades and reporting their findings. Here, they hurriedly lay out a plan for the attack. The rangers will divide their forces and sweep down upon the Comanche camp from 2 directions. 2nd Lieutenant Wren will lead the smaller contingent to the right of the cluster of cedar trees which holds the Comanche camp, while Noah Smithwick will lead the second, larger contingent which will attack the camp head-on. With the morning sun now rapidly on the rise, the rangers hasten forth to make their attack. As the surrounding birds begin to chirp, Smithwick moves his men into position, and then notices that, in the dimly lit morning hue, Wren has taken his party past the intended target, having mistaken which cluster of cedar trees to attack. With no means to communicate with his commanding officer, Smithwick knows that the only course of action is to carry forward with the assault. Moments after Smithwick realizes Wren's mistake, the first of the Comanche warriors begins to stir awake, only yards away from Smithwick and his men. Still in a haze, the warrior sleepily pulls himself into a sitting position and begins to sing his personal song, a long-standing Comanche tradition, as a greeting to the morning sun. However, the man singing has alerted Wren to his mistake, and he now leads his contingent hurriedly towards the sound of the singing Comanche. The Comanche warrior, now alerted by the sounds of Wren and his rangers running towards him through the brush, jumps to his feet and attempts to run back to his cohorts in the camp. He sprints forward, crying out to his comrades that an attack is underway. However, he has scarcely gone but a few yards when a lead ball from Ranger Joe Weeks' rifle tears into his back, sending him tumbling to the ground, dead. Now, the Comanche are fully alerted, and the camp springs to life, with warriors attempting to arm themselves while making a retreat to a nearby ravine. Wren and Smithwick's forces now make a charge on the Comanche camp from their planned sides, unleashing a cacophonous volley into the scrambling warriors, hoping to kill any and all that they can before they are able to arm themselves. Most of the Comanche, however, are able to make their way to the nearby ravine. From here, they begin to mount a counterattack of their own, pouring arrows and bullets in amongst the rangers. A vicious battle ensues, with the rangers taking cover and making repeated charges upon the Comanche in the ravine. On one of these charges, a Comanche bullet strikes the young private Philip Martin in the head, killing him instantly. The Rangers, incensed at having incurred the loss of the much-liked young man, redoubled their efforts to finish off the Comanche in the ravine. The fight continues on, but soon the Comanche are able to slip away from the ravine and disappear into the cedar breaks. They have left their horse herd and most of their belongings, much of which are plundered and claimed by the Rangers as spoils of their efforts. A thorough post-action examination of the battlefield is also made in an effort to discern the damage inflicted upon the Comanche. As far as either Wren or Smithwick could tell, the first Comanche warrior to awake and be fired upon had surely died where he had fallen. In his recollection, Smithwick recalls specifically that, in his charge towards the camp, he had stepped over the body of the warrior lying lifeless on the ground. But, after the battle, the warrior's body is nowhere to be found. The body of Philip Martin is lashed to his horse, and the party somberly make their way eastward, back down the Colorado River and into the confines of the fort. Here, Philip Martin is laid to rest with honors, alongside the body of a private who had been killed months earlier by an accidental rifle discharge. The Rangers will go on to refine their techniques and tactics in combating the Comanche, and the Comanche, for decades to come, will assert their dominance over the whole of central and northern Texas via endless, vicious warfare and raiding. In the annals of their conflict's history, this conflict, however minor, is indicative of the all-too-common succession of events that would occur countless times across the Texas frontier, one in which the martial spirit that drove the very survival of the Rangers resulted in the loss of one of their own, for what was ultimately an unverifiable and inconsequential toll exacted upon their enemy. Many of the men at the fort will, however, go on to fulfill and even extend their enlistments with the Rangers, continuing on to legendary careers on the violent expanses of the Texas frontier, as well as in the brutal fighting of the Mexican-American War. Noah Smithwick would go on to pen an autobiography, link in the description, that is regarded as one of the most comprehensive accounts of early Ranger life left by one of their own. It is replete with tales of conflict, camaraderie, violence, and vengeance, and is an invaluable resource for anyone interested in further reading on this fascinating, often overlooked era of history. But the many tales of Noah Smithwick, as well as his fellow Rangers and the mighty, fearsome Comanche warriors with whom they fought, are, for tonight, other stories for other times. Texas, March 19, 1840. Amidst the rolling limestone hills, oak-strewn pastures, and vibrant Texas wildflowers, a contingent of Comanche men, women, and children made their way to the town of San Antonio, under the guidance of their band's most revered war chief, Mugwara, or Spirit Talker. They had come bearing items for trade and were looking forward to a revelrous and hopefully profitable day. They had come, they assumed, to trade for needed wares and to barter their goods. This was not unheard of, nor even altogether uncommon on the Texas frontier. The warfare and bloodshed that was underway in the War for Texas was a far more fluid affair than is often portrayed today, and trading between yesterday's enemy and tomorrow's foe was often as much a matter of convenience as it was necessity. In fact, Spirit Talker himself had strode the line between collegiality and combativeness, between cultures far more frequently and more adeptly than most. In the years prior, he had provided not only shelter to Texas Rangers, his presumed mortal enemy, but had defended them from attack by the neighboring Wacos. On this day, the problem was, as far as the residents of San Antonio were concerned, that the Comanche's wares included not just goods, but a person. A daughter of a San Antonio resident. She and her sister had been kidnapped from their family farm on the Texas frontier 2 years earlier. Her name was Matilda Lockhart. She was 16 years old in 1840, and the last 2 years of her life had been a living nightmare that had seen her kidnapped, sold into slavery, sexual and otherwise, subjected to abuses, sexual and otherwise, humiliation, subjugation, and even mutilation. Not only had she been repeatedly raped and forced to labor under pain of violence, her nose had been burned to her face. The cartilage on her nose had been burned off to the bone on her face. Famed Texas frontier woman Mary Maverick cared for Lockhart upon her arrival in San Antonio and described her experience. She described Miss Lockhart's condition as, quote, utterly degraded and could not hold her head up again. Her head, arms, and face were full of bruises and sores, and her nose actually burnt off to the bone, all the fleshy end gone, and a great scab formed on the end of the bone. Both nostrils were wide open and denuded of flesh. She told a piteous tale, how dreadfully the Indians had beaten her, and how they would wake her from her sleep by sticking a chunk of fire to her flesh, especially to her nose. Her body had many scars from the fire. End quote. There is some dispute among historians as to the entirety of the veracity of Mary Maverick's account, as several preceding accounts of Comanche visitors who had encountered Matilda and a contingent of other white and Mexican women and children who had been kidnapped and made captives and slaves of the band failed to mention such outward and obvious signs of physical torture. However, as conflicting as the accounts may be on this matter, it is safe to say Matilda Lockhart's appearance sparked an outrage in the residents of San Antonio for two reasons. One, that she had suffered enough physical abuse for it to be easily visually discernible by all present. And two, that she was the only captive present. Earlier in the year, General Sidney Albert Johnson had ordered. The problem with this approach, aside from its blank check for bloodshed should its acceptable terms not be reached, was that it presumed that the Comanche had a centralized power structure of chiefs. This was not the case with the Comanche. They were not under one chief. They did not even cede full political power to band headmen outside of the times of war. And even then, the warrior with the most power was the one able to raise the most warriors for his proposed raid or battle against the enemy du jour. The Comanche had no centralized power, and thus could not be negotiated with as a singular entity. This was not only unknown to most whites at the time, it was all but incomprehensible to them. And, even if they did understand it, it made negotiating the return of hostages from the Comanche a daunting, if not impossible task. Now, on this warm spring day, as the contingent of Comanche composed of unarmed men, women, and children made their way through the mud-laden and refuse-strewn streets of San Antonio, they stopped to pick up pieces of scrap iron to use for arrows and spears. This further confounded the Texans present and added to the overall surreality and awkwardness of the situation. Some residents tried to make nice with the visitors, setting up small targets for the children to shoot with their toy bows and arrows. But as the word spread that there was only one white woman captive present, and that she was terribly disfigured, the collective ire of San Antonio focused on the Comanche that stood in front of them. The commanding military officer present, Colonel William Fisher, summoned the 12 chiefs present to what was known as the Council House, a one-story 18th century stone building in the plaza of the city. In fact, you can still go to this place where this all happened. You can still go there today. It's on the east side of the main plaza in San Antonio behind the Drury Inn. The original building is gone, but there is still a two-story structure where the council house stood. The Comanche chiefs came inside, still assuming that this would be an amiable affair, and took seats on the floor along the wall. The contingent of Texans present, including military and Texas Rangers, stood lining the other three walls, assuming what seemed to be strangely ominous positions to the chiefs present. When all were assembled, Colonel Fisher spoke curtly through a translator to Spirit Talker, who served as the spokesman for his group. The colonel demanded to know where the other captives were and why the chief had not seen fit to honor his prior commitment of returning the white captives under his charge. Spirit Talker, still assuming this entire situation was one big misunderstanding, his tone seemed to vacillate between peaceable and haughty as he took greater and greater offense to the colonel's accusations. But he made no overtly offensive comments or movements, only concluding his explanation with the question, "How do you like that answer?" However sought after Spirit Talker had been in his life until this point as a great speaker and negotiator and a downright likable guy, he fatally misread his audience on this occasion. Colonel Fisher became enraged and stated that he did not like Spirit Talker's answer one bit, and that now Spirit Talker and his cohort of chiefs were under arrest until all of the Texas hostages were returned. Some soldiers moved to block the door, as others moved toward the Comanche chiefs, intending to subdue and handcuff them before transporting them to the San Antonio jail. In these fleeting moments, as the gravity of the situation settled in on Spirit Talker and his cohort of war chiefs, there seemed to be an air of confusion and disbelief. Then, in a flash, the violence started. Spirit Talker pulled a knife he had concealed on his person and stabbed one of the soldiers in the chest as he made a break for the door. The other chiefs all either pulled concealed weapons of their own or attempted to grab the rifles of the soldiers, hoping to either make a break for their lives or sell their lives as dearly as possible. Inside the small room, gunfire erupted, with eardrum rattling volume and intensity. As smoke filled the room, bodies began to thud to the ground, some dead, some dying, some injured, and some still fighting. Ranger Matthew Caldwell, known as Old Paint because of his terribly sun-mottled skin, took a round to the shin, hit the ground in agony, while still pulling his sidearm and beginning to systematically shoot down any Comanche that he could. The fight spilled quickly outside the doors, as the fleeing chiefs who emerged alive alerted their tribesmen of what was coming. What transpired was an hours-long, city-wide carnival of carnage. The children, who had been shooting at targets with their toy bows and arrows, turned them on live targets, drilling a number of residents with very real arrows, and even killing a district judge by drilling him in the heart with several arrows. He fell dead in the street as the Comanche desperately attempted to fight their way out of San Antonio. The residents, soldiers, and rangers present were now on a house-by-house kill or capture mission to bring in as many Comanche as they could and kill any who would not surrender or did not surrender to the Texans' standards. 2 warriors attempted to take refuge in a local home, barricading themselves inside. The Texians set fire to the roof, smoking the Comanches out of the house. As soon as they escaped the door, one was shot down and the other had his head split open with an axe. All the Comanche who were not killed outright were shuffled into the open-roofed jailhouse and placed under arrest. They were told they would be detained until all Texan captives had been returned to San Antonio. One Comanche was given a horse and told to ride back to the camp they had come from to inform the rest of their tribesmen of what had happened, what the new terms were, and that the Texans meant business. The rider made haste northward, over the limestone cliffs and oak meadows, back to the home camp of his band. Upon learning what happened to their friends and relatives, the camp itself erupted into its own torrent of grief, anger, despair, and hate. The wives of the slain chiefs and warriors mutilated themselves, cutting off their hair, slashing their breasts, and cutting off their fingertips. One inflicted such severe wounds on herself that she died of severe blood loss. Then, one by one, starting with Matilda Lockhart's own 6-year-old sister, all the captives who had not been adopted into the tribe were dragged from their tents, stripped naked, and roasted alive over hot Comanche campfires on the dry, sun-soaked Texas plains. They were mocked and taunted as they begged for their lives, not understanding in their last moments that they were the penance for the deeds of their would-be rescuers. After this hours-long ordeal, each and every horse belonging to the dead chiefs and warriors was slaughtered by bashing in its head, shooting it with arrows, or slitting its throat. Thousands of dead horses, as the Comanche had exponentially more than any tribe, soon covered the now blood-soaked plains. For both the Texans and the Comanche, there would be no conciliatory terms offered. Now, this was a war to the end. But this story is just getting started. What the Comanche did next would be warfare the likes of which no tribe had ever seen or been able to accomplish on either scale or ferocity. They were about to take this war all the way to the Gulf of Mexico, and they planned to either kill every Texan they could or drive them into the ocean. But that is a story for another day. In the years 73 to 71 BC, as Spartacus led his band of rebels through the territory outside of Capua in the south of what is today Italy, the Roman legions were met with a challenge that their training had not prepared them for. The guerrilla tactics of Spartacus and his men wrought havoc on Roman legionnaires not just physically, but psychologically. This rebellion against the world's greatest power by a band of slaves turned gladiators who roamed the hillsides and struck without warning struck terror into many a neophyte soldier's heart. And this terror began to eat away at the one thing that, in warfare, must be maintained at all cost: discipline. Legions began to break and run in battle, succumbing to their own terror rather than to be cut down at the hands of the rebels. The general in charge, Marcus Licinius Crassus, knew that this behavior could not be allowed to stand. So, he gathered up 500 of those who had fled. Those 500 were separated into groups of 10. In those groups, lots were drawn, with one unlucky man being singled out. He was then marched in front of his comrades, and his friends and cohorts with whom he had trained, traveled, dined, and fought were then made to beat him to death with clubs. One can only imagine the scene as crying young men did their best to muster enough strength to swing their club as hard as possible and thus elicit as much mercy as they could in the situation, all while trying not to make eye contact with the man whose life they were ending, nor the other 8 men around them being forced to endure and exact the same trauma. The Romans were not the only culture to impose this practice, though they did give it its name: decimation, the decim being Latin for 10. Alexander the Great would use it, as would commanders well into the 20th century. But tonight, we're going to talk about when it was used by a famous Mexican general to punish a group of rebellious Texans. This is the story of the Black Bean Incident. Ciudad Mier, Mexico, December 27th, 1842. 60 Texans lay dead in the streets of the small town on the banks of the Rio Grande. 243 more had surrendered to the local commander Pedro de Ampudia, in hopes of avoiding the no-quarter policy that had been wrought against their countrymen at the Alamo 6 years earlier. They had hoped to exact retribution on the Mexican city and the people and soldiers present for what they called the Dawson Massacre, in which a few weeks prior, a number of Texans had been killed and taken prisoner by Mexican forces outside of the city of San Antonio de Bejar, today San Antonio. Don't worry, the Dawson Massacre can and will have its own episode. On February 11th, 1843, 181 of the Texans escaped. However, by the end of the month, the lack of food and water in the mountainous Mexican desert resulted in 176 of them surrendering or being recaptured near Salado, Tamaulipas. Only 3 of the original escapees managed to make it back to Texas. They were made to continue their march southward until they reached Saltillo, Mexico. Here they were informed that the commander of the Mexican army, Santa Anna, was irate at their attempted flight and demanding that they be executed to a man. He was eventually talked down from the slaughtering of the Texans en masse and instead settled on subjecting the prisoners, who, not being part of an official government force, were not protected by the rules of war, to a sadistic game of chance, in which some would secure their lives and others would ensure their deaths. That game would be played on March 25, 1843. The commanding officer that day was Colonel Domingo Huerta. According to numerous first-hand accounts, a large clay jar was brought out. Huerta ordered the men assembled and that the large clay jar should be brought to the front of the formation. Into the jar were first placed 159 white beans. Then, 17 black beans were placed into the jar. The men were then informed that they would be made to draw beans from the jar, one man at a time. Anyone who drew a white bean would be allowed to live. Anyone who drew a black bean would be executed by firing squad. The officers were made to draw first, with a substantial number being among the unlucky. This is, by some, attributed to the order in which the beans were placed into the jar. It is asserted that, if this was the case, it would be meant to place the beans closer to the top, and in having the officers draw first, ensure that more of them would perish than their enlisted counterparts. Major James Decatur drew the first black bean. Unflinchingly resigned to his fate, he held the small legume up in between his thumb and forefinger and declared, "Boys, I told you so. I never failed in my life to draw a prize." He said the Mexicans were only robbing him of 40 years. One by one, as they opened their hands to reveal black beans, 16 more Texans came to the cold, hard realization that they would never see home again. They were William Mosby Eastland, Patrick Mahan, James M. Ogden, James N. Torrey, Martin Carroll Wing, John L. Cash, Robert Holmes Dunham, Edward E. Est, Robert Harris, Thomas L. Jones, Christopher Roberts, William N. Rowan, James L. Shepard, J. N. M. Thompson, James Turnbull, and Henry Walling. The men were all given pens and paper and a few minutes to write letters home and reconcile themselves with God. Then they were separated into two groups, one of 8 men, the other of 9 men. The first group was marched into the courtyard, blindfolded, and shot dead by a line of Mexican soldiers, with any not killed in the initial volley being finished off with a shot to the head by one of the officers present. The second group was marched in, lined up with the bodies of their comrades still warm and bleeding at their feet, and shot down themselves. James L. Shepard was shot and gravely wounded, but managed to play dead until the soldiers left the plaza. He slipped out into the night with a bullet lodged in his jaw, an arm that did not work, and no idea where to go or what to do. In the end, his suffering was only prolonged. He was found and shot dead by Mexican soldiers within a matter of hours. One officer, Captain Ewan Cameron, who had been a ringleader in the attempted escape, had escaped the firing squads by drawing a white bean. However, an entire month later, when Santa Anna found this out, he ordered Cameron pulled out of the ranks of prisoners and executed anyways. Fairness be damned. Cameron, a resolute Protestant as were essentially all Texans present, staunchly denied an offer to confess to a priest before his execution. Instead, he marched out, refused a blindfold, ripped open his shirt, and declared that he would die proudly for his beloved Texas. He was shot dead and buried at Perote Prison in Veracruz, Mexico. It would not be until September 16, 1844, after endless diplomatic besiegement, that Santa Anna would offer the release and return of the Texas prisoners. They were free now to go home, to leave the Mexican prison and return to their lives and families. And this they did, with many returning to Texas and resuming their lives as settlers, entrepreneurs, soldiers, lawmen, or some combination of the above. But their inclinations were not to forget, and their intentions were not to forgive. Their time as prisoners and their surviving of what history would come to know as the Black Bean Incident would shape their psyches. Many of the men who had survived, including Bigfoot Wallace and Samuel Walker, burned for revenge and suffered genuine trauma from the event. One can only imagine how many sleepless nights they endured, attempting to come to terms with their memories and to steel their resolve to exact retribution in due time. That time would come for these young men, who would go on to comprise a large bulk of the Ranger fighting force, and it would come soon. In 1847, the Mexican-American War would kick off, and the Texas Rangers would be drawn away from the hill country of Texas and into the dusty plains and jungled hills of central and northern Mexico. Here they would perpetrate some of the most terminal and resolute violence that had been seen anywhere before. But that is another story for another time. El Paso, Texas, December 1932. Legendary Texas author and journalist Frank J. Dobie sits in his hotel room, impatiently glancing at the door every few minutes. He has spent a restless afternoon reviewing his notes and readying himself to receive a well-known guest he has long waited to interview. Finally, in the early evening, a knock comes at the hotel room door. Dobie opens the door and is greeted with the imposing frame and genteel smile of the legendary Texas cowboy he has heard so much about, yet never met. The man's name is Frank Collinson. He is an Englishman by birth, having come to Texas from his beloved homeland in 1872, when he was only 17 years old. He has spent the vast majority of his time since then living the hard, solitary, dangerous existence of a working cowboy on the Texas frontier. He is also, though, a lifelong reader, and a man with a profound proclivity for intellectual pursuits, such as philosophy, science, and writing. Dobie and Collinson shake hands and exchange pleasantries, as Dobie welcomes the elderly man into his room and out of the December chill. Dobie, already a noted authority on the history of Texas and the American Southwest, has sought Collinson out with the hopes of solving a mystery that he himself has been unable to answer, despite years of research and investigation. After settling into a chair, Collinson, well aware of Dobie's reputation and record, wastes little time broaching the subject of Texas history and regional legends. Collinson asks whether or not Dobie ever got a chance to meet the legendary Texas Ranger William Bigfoot Wallace. Dobie responds that, regrettably, he never had the chance to meet the iconic Ranger face to face. But, he adds, he is well aware of his exploits. With this, Collinson leans into the lamplight, locking eyes with Dobie, a serious expression now drawn across his face. "Did you ever hear of Jeff Turner, the Indian hater?" he inquires. "Yes," replies Dobie, suddenly feeling unnerved, as if he is caught in an impromptu inquisition meant to suss out whether or not he is indeed worthy of the information now stored only within the confines of Collinson's memory. "I have read about him in Duvall's book on Bigfoot Wallace," referring to the 1871 publication written by John C. Duvall entitled The Adventures of Bigfoot Wallace. Apparently satisfied, a knowing smile spreads across Collinson's face, and a sorrowful look takes hold of his eyes as his mind is momentarily lost in the glory and gore of days now long gone. "Does the book tell what became of Jeff Turner?" he asks. "No, and I have often wondered," replies Dobie, now situated unconsciously on the very edge of his hotel seat, already ensconced in the story about to be told. "Well, Bigfoot told me," Collinson opines, and then, as Dobie sits enthralled, begins to tell the tale of what actually happened to the legendary Texas wild man. Turner had come to Texas with his wife and children in the 1830s and settled on a plot of land on the Guadalupe River. For a time, the family had thrived on their small plot of land in the bucolic rolling hill country of central Texas. However, tragedy had struck one morning after Turner had gone out hunting alone. Texas was, at the time, one of the most dangerous locations on Earth. This was due to one predominant factor above all others, that of the mighty Comanche nation. The Comanche had ruled over this land for the better part of 2 centuries and were feared by virtually all. Though more of a cohesive unit of bands than a cultural monolith, by the 1840s, the Comanche oversaw a veritable empire that spanned from southern Kansas to northern Mexico, as far west as Colorado, and as far east as the burgeoning city of Dallas, Texas. They have risen to prominence via decades of brutal raiding and warfare that saw countless men, women, and children fall to Comanche lances, arrows, and tomahawks. Time and again, until their eventual capitulation and confinement to the reservation system in the 1870s, Comanche war parties would strike in brutal raids against any and all who occupied even the fringes of their territories. Whether the victims were Mexican settlers, Tonkawan villagers, or Texan farmers, the standard operating procedure for a Comanche raid would routinely see all fighting-age males killed in horrific ways, infants often dispatched, and women and children summarily kidnapped and abused. Oftentimes, whole families would simply be slaughtered, scalped, and left where they had fallen. Such had been the case for the terribly unfortunate Turner family. Jeff Turner had scarcely left his homestead more than half an hour before he heard the blood-curdling sounds of his wife and 3 boys under attack by the Comanche. Turner had sprinted back, only to find his wife and children's lifeless forms strewn about their cabin. When the attacking Comanche returned to finish him off, he had inflicted so much damage that, after believing they had mortally wounded him, the Comanches fled, leaving him for dead. But Turner had not died. He had survived, but his psyche had been irreparably scarred. After recovering for several months under the care of charitable neighbors, Turner would move to a small camp on Chicoloth Creek, north of Victoria, Texas. His life from then on would revolve solely around exacting his revenge on the Comanche for the murder of his beloved family. He would head out alone, atop his trusted horse, a volatile jet-black Mustang named Pepper Pod, following any Comanche trail he could find in the whole of South Texas. He would pursue the Comanche at any opportunity, ambushing them individually, on the trail, or in watering holes. He would dispatch them with his lengthy hunting knife, scalp them, and cure the gruesome trophies inside his tent on Chicoloth Creek. For the next few years, Turner would appear sporadically at the Zumwalt settlement near present-day Seguin, Texas, in order to procure basic goods and sundries. Though he kept mostly to himself, his eyes would glitter, and his demeanor would become as animated as a vaudevillian actor when describing the intricacies of his macabre favorite pastime. It was these eyes and odd mannerisms that had so unnerved Bigfoot Wallace and his ranger company when they had crossed paths with Turner in 1840. Wallace and his cohorts had been in pursuit of Comanche horse thieves in South Texas when Turner had appeared seemingly out of thin air and offered to guide them through the country he knew so well. Though the party of young rangers were at first dubious as to how much help this seemingly derelict man would be, it would be less than a day later when Turner would prove his merit as both a tracker and a fighter. The party not only recouped their horses in a small but violent skirmish in South Texas, but all were witness to Turner's monomaniacal fury in battle against the Comanche. As they made their way back to the Zumwalt settlement, it was Turner alone whose belt was adorned with several freshly taken Comanche scalps. Wallace had been profoundly impacted by his interactions with Turner, being taken aback both by his story of personal tragedy as well as the frightening intensity of his desire for revenge. But after his company had moved on from the Zumwalt settlement area, Bigfoot was left with only anecdotes and speculation as to the ultimate fate of the local legend, Jeff Turner. These he had passed along to Collinson. Neither had been included in Duval's account, as they were thought too gruesome for the sensibilities of its Victorian readership. In the first of these accounts, Turner is finally caught sleeping by the Comanche in a remote South Texas cold camp in the middle of the night. He is well known among the entirety of the Comanche tribe as a near-feral and wildly vicious white man who had scalped many of their people. He is also, though, regarded as a man with a fierce fighting heart. This, even as an enemy combatant, made him useful to the Comanche. In the theological worldview of the Comanche, there is no singular great spirit to be worshipped. Instead, they believe there to be a universal medicine or power, known as puha, that the Comanche believe to reside in all natural things, from rocks to buffalo. In Turner's case, it is his heart that is believed to hold great power. Thus, once Turner is confined as a Comanche prisoner, he is treated even more harshly than most. Turner is bound and brought to the camp of a major chief within the band. He is dragged to the door of the chief's lodge, inside which resides the chief along with his pregnant wife. The morning sun has not long hung in the Texas sky, but already its repressive heat has begun to exact its toll on the already battered and bedraggled prisoner. The flap which serves as the door of the teepee suddenly swings open, and out steps an imposing middle-aged man, whose face is creased from both the withering of time and his scarcely concealable rage. The chief closely examines the features and stature of this hated Taibo, the Comanche's name for the whites. As the warriors surrounding the chief and Turner taunt and sneer at their captive, the chief motions for them to commence with the ritual at hand. Turner is thrown to the ground, where he is beaten and clubbed further still, as the lashings that bind his hands are undone and 4 warriors grab him. Turner is held down as each of his arms and legs are tethered to wooden stakes buried deep into the hard ground. Turner, for his part, remains silent, though perpetually wide-eyed throughout, as the taunts and insults are hurled at him from assembled villagers, and blows continue to rain down upon him at varying intervals from warriors who had been so long aggrieved by his antics. It is possible that Turner's thoughts turn to his late wife and children. Then, as if on cue, the assembled Comanche villagers and warriors go silent. The chief now walks over to the door of his lodge and again swings it open. Except this time, his wife emerges from the cavernous darkness inside. She is slightly younger than the chief, possessive of a dignified, natural beauty, and in the latter stages of pregnancy. She is ritually adorned in paint and feathers, and, instead of the perpetual disdain that contorts her husband's face, her expression is one of placid indifference. She is brought forth towards Turner's position by 2 female handlers, and sat down perhaps a yard away from the increasingly unnerved Texan, whose breathing rate is beginning to increase by the second. As the sun begins its final ascension towards its noontime apex, the brutal ceremony at hand reaches its climax. The chief brandishes a large hunting knife meant for the butchering of buffalo. For an agonizing few minutes, Turner is taunted with up-close shows of the frightful blade and mock attacks. Finally, Turner is cruelly dismembered at the hands of the Comanche chief, with his heart being removed and then served to his wife, who consumes it in the belief that it will make their unborn child strong and brave. Turner's remains are unceremoniously disposed of, and he is never seen again in the Zumwalt settlement. In the second version of Turner's demise, Turner is said to have been briefly paired with a like-minded frontiersman named Smokey, who shares Turner's penchant and proclivity for collecting Comanche scalps. One day, as they are ranging around the Texas hill country, the duo come upon a family being attacked by a Comanche raiding party. Turner and Smokey are able to draw the attention and ire of the raiding party, who give up their raid on the family and pursue the 2 men after the pair shot down 2 of the Comanche warriors from a distance. Turner and Smokey then flee into what proves to be a box canyon, a natural, steeply walled enclosure with no way out save for the way the 2 men had come in. With the sun sinking and darkness rapidly approaching, the men are able to find a small cave, about as wide in circumference as a wooden barrel, into which they crawl, one after the other. After crawling back into the cave a few yards, the tunnel opens up slightly so that the men can inch along in a crouched position. They advance further into the cave, seeking to put as much distance between themselves and their Comanche pursuers as possible. Turner takes the lead as the men move forward at a tortuously slow pace, in total darkness. Suddenly, the unmistakable sound of a rattlesnake's rattle whirs out within the tight confines of the cave. Both men stop instantly. Turner has a book of Mexican wax matches in his pocket. He retrieves one and strikes it, illuminating a truly nightmarish scene. No more than 10 feet away from the men, is a writhing mass of diamondback rattlesnakes, with some branching off and slithering closer towards them while others flee deeper into the cave. With no better solution, both men hold their crouched positions, motionless. Minutes drag by, with the men fearful that any move will draw a strike from one of the venomous creatures. Suddenly, though, Turner's leg spasms, forcing him to shift his weight ever so slightly. But this adjustment, however minute, is still enough to draw the attention of one of the increasingly agitated diamondbacks. The animal strikes Turner, sealing his fate. "Smokey," whispers the terrified Turner, "I've lifted my last scalp." With the Comanche prowling outside, an attempt at escape is an implausible option. All Smokey can do is stay with his friend as Turner expires. Within a short time, Turner begins to twist and contort, limited only by the confines of the earthen walls. He then begins to hallucinate. He grabs Smokey's arm and confides in a hushed, panicked tone, "Look, there's a hole in the ground right in front of me. It's the skylight to hell, and I wonder why the devil left it uncovered." Then, in the words of Frank J. Dobie's own account of the event titled Between the Comanche and the Rattlesnake, "In extravagancies that would have satisfied any exhorter holding a sinner over brimstone furnaces, he described his own advance into the torture of heat and power of hellish beings." By the time the sun rises again, Turner's body is cold in death. The rattlesnake horde has receded further into the cave, while the Comanche war party has moved on. Smokey does his best to respectfully inter Turner's remains in a makeshift grave near Fort Phantom Hill, near present-day Abilene, Texas. Though we can never be fully sure of exactly how the legendary Jeff Turner the Indian hater lost his life, it is safe to say that he likely expired the same way that he had lived, ensnared in a noxious cycle of violence and anger. And while Turner's legend certainly stands out, as he is even known by many elderly residents of Texas to this day, the tragedy and torment that so unfortunately encapsulated his life are not at all unique in the experience of the Old West, and in Texas in particular. The tales of violence, vengeance, and retribution carried out upon and at the behest of the Comanche, the Texans, the Mexicans, the Apache, the Tonkawa, the Karankawa, the Kiowa, and the Spanish in Texas's long and storied history are, to be sure, too numerous to cover in one episode. Rest assured that we will certainly do our best to cover these important events in as much depth and breadth as possible, but for tonight, they are other stories for other times. Bastrop, Texas, February 24th, 1839. In the late winter chill of a placid evening, the citizens of this small village east of Austin find themselves largely engaged with chores and preparations for evening meals. While Texas is an independent republic, having established its independence from Mexico in the Texas Revolution of 1836, it is still a slave-holding territory. Several of the wealthier citizens of Bastrop are slave owners, and thus many of the local inhabitants are slaves, subject to the dehumanizing effects of chattel servitude, even here, on the bleeding edges of Western civilization's westernmost expansion. Adding to the cultural milieu that is commonplace here in 1830s Texas are several Quiche natives, as well as Tejano citizens, native Texans of Hispanic descent. Though all are subject to the stratified racial and economic hierarchy of early 19th century America, here on the Texas frontier, they live under the auspices of a singular fear that is shared by all. That of the incessant, horrifically violent raiding being carried out all across the Texas frontier by the dreaded lords of the southern plains, the Comanche. Time and time again in the preceding decade, Texas settlers found themselves subject to acts of violence and degradation that had scarcely, if ever, been seen by their predecessors east of the Mississippi. Countless homesteads across the Texas frontier had been laid waste to, with entire families killed or carried off into slavery. Torture killings were common, as were all manner of assaults, including sexual and otherwise. The attacks did not discriminate by race, gender, social class, religious affiliation, nationality, nor age. The Apache, the Tonkawa, the Karankawa, the Spanish, and the Mexicans who have inhabited Texas since the early 18th century have all fallen victim to the Comanche. The inhabitants of central Texas in 1839 are but the latest iteration of a people living on the fringes of what had come to be known to the Spanish as Comancheria. The threat of raiding is in fact so pervasive that the town of Bastrop has its own warning system, instituted by Texas Ranger, Texas Revolution veteran, and Texas Army Chief of Staff, Colonel Edward Burleson. In the event of a Comanche raiding party being sighted, citizens are instructed to sound off with a long retort from a bugle-like brass horn, followed by 2 gunshots in rapid succession. Upon hearing this, the neighboring homestead is to repeat the signal until it reaches the vicinity of the town of Bastrop itself. Here, a small cannon will be fired, serving as the call for the local men to muster and prepare for a Comanche attack. However, as the hue of dusk begins to settle over the city of Bastrop and its surrounding farms and plantations, the threat of Comanche violence seems a world away. Then, suddenly, just as most of the town's inhabitants are getting ready to settle in for their evening meal, the high-pitched, monotone intonations of a bugle can be heard in the distance, followed quickly by 2 gunshots. Less than a minute later, even nearer to the center of town, the same piercing retort of a bugle, followed by 2 gunshots, can be heard. Moments later, the cacophonous rumble of a small cannon can be heard roaring from the center of town. The Comanche, it seems, have struck again. As the fighting-age men assemble in the town square, word quickly circulates as to the cause of the alarm. A local family, the Colemans, have been attacked. Though not necessarily unique on the Texas frontier, the story that now spreads like wildfire through the town of Bastrop is sickeningly violent, and demonstrative of the extremely violent, often macabre nature of Comanche raids in Texas. A combined force of Caddo, Waco, and Comanche raiders had struck the homestead of Elizabeth Coleman, a recently widowed mother, and her 5 children. Her eldest son James had been out in the Coleman's fields with a family friend named James Rogers, plowing rows for spring crops. They had been the first to be set upon by the Comanche, who cut them off from retreat to the family cabin. The 2 young men had made their escape through a thickly forested area, but would be too late in securing help for their loved ones. Minutes after abandoning the chase for Rogers and James Coleman, the large force of native warriors fell upon Elizabeth Coleman and her 4 younger children. Elizabeth and the children had been in front of the Coleman's family cabin, working in the garden situated roughly 50 yards from the door. Suddenly, the young mother and her children saw the blood-curdling sight of several hundred native warriors charging towards them at full speed. Elizabeth Coleman had screamed for the children to flee to the cabin, and all but the youngest, 5-year-old Thomas Coleman, had been able to make it. Thomas Coleman, however, was swooped up violently by a warrior on horseback. Seeing this, Elizabeth Coleman had turned course and attempted to help her youngest son. Within seconds of instinctually whirling about in order to pursue her captured child, she had been struck in the throat by an arrow. She had fled back to the cabin, making it through the door and helping her 12-year-old son, Albert Coleman, bar the door to prevent the attacking warriors, now dismounted and assaulting the front door, from gaining entry. Elizabeth had then collapsed, mortally wounded, as Albert Coleman gathered the 3 guns kept at the cabin. Amidst the shrieks of his siblings and the dire condition of his mother, 12-year-old Albert had put up a truly unbelievable fight against the Comanche and their native allies. He fired upon any warrior who managed to breach the door, killing one outright and wounding another. He then raised one of the cabin's floorboards and instructed his younger siblings to hide underneath them and to not make a sound until they heard voices speaking in English. The preteen boy then continued reloading and firing his weapons, pouring out such voluminous fire that the attacking warriors assumed there to be several grown men defending the cabin. Finally, however, young Albert was fatally wounded by a shot from one of the attacking warriors. With his last breaths, he reiterated his instructions to his siblings hidden beneath the floorboards before finally collapsing near the body of his mother. The attacking party of Comanche and their allies had then taken the young Thomas Coleman and carried their attack on to the neighboring farmstead of one Dr. Joseph Robertson. Robertson and his family were not home. However, there were several unfortunate slaves who, without access to firearms, were unable to proffer any kind of defense. 7 of them were summarily taken away by the attacking native forces, destined for lives as slaves amongst the Comanche and their allies. It would be late in the afternoon, several hours after the attack, that a young neighbor of the Colemans named John D. Anderson found the farmstead to be curiously silent and devoid of activity. He had been the first to discover the grisly scene at the Coleman cabin, and had managed to rescue the two youngest children hidden under the floorboards. From here, realizing the danger all three of them were now in, Anderson had set the youngsters astride his horse and made a mad dash to Wells Fort, roughly 12 miles to the west. From here, the children were placed under a guard and runners were sent out to the surrounding towns. These runners alerted the first homestead they had arrived at, initiating the chain of warning shots that now cuts through the air in Bastrop. The men from Bastrop and other surrounding counties coalesced their forces at Wells Fort. While gathered at the fort, Jacob Burleson, brother of the famed Colonel Edward Burleson, is elected to take command. Jacob Burleson and his company of rangers and ad hoc volunteers begin searching the area for the Comanche war party they know to be close by. The search continues into the night, and into the next morning, when finally, at about 10 a.m., the large raiding party is spotted near what is known as Post Oak Island, located roughly 4 miles north of Brushy Creek. Though much of the popular lore surrounding such encounters on the Texas frontier is centered on the actual combat, the biggest problem encountered by the Texans combating the Comanche and other native tribes was actually finding their adversary on the vast expanses of this seemingly endless landscape. With this foremost task now accomplished, the Texians pursue their quarry at full gallop. And a classic Comanche tactic, still relatively unknown to their Anglo adversaries in the 1830s, the Comanche now feign a full-scale retreat. The Comanche and their allies make a mad dash for a thickly wooded thicket, while the Texians, starting roughly from a half a mile behind, pursue them in a zigzag course, aiming to cut off any additional path of retreat. As the Texians proceed to within rifle range of the Comanche, they dismount and form a battle line. While this practice was common in the eastern woodlands, here on the open expanses of Texas, it is perhaps the biggest tactical blunder that can be made. As soon as the rangers' and volunteers' boots are on the ground, the Comanche and their allies immediately turn their ponies and make a headlong attack at the now footbound Texians. This catches the Texians off guard and sends the line of men scattering towards their own horses. One of the young rangers, a man by the name of W.S. Wallace, sees his horse panic and race off towards the Comanche lines, instantly becoming a trophy for the native forces. Now on foot and helpless, Wallace makes a sprint in the direction of his comrades in a desperate bid to escape. Seeing the dire straits of his compatriot, Captain Jack Haney turns his mount around, races back towards Wallace, and sweeps him onto his horse. The two narrowly escape a hail of Comanche arrows, which would have all but certainly resulted in grievous injury or death. Further down the Texian line, Captain Jacob Burleson, along with Franklin Highsmith and the teenaged Winslow Turner, arrive at their horses just in time to potentially evade the oncoming Comanche charge. However, in their panicked frenzy, the young Turner forgets to untie his horse, which is picketed to the ground. Seeing this, Captain Jacob Burleson turns, rushes back towards the youngster, dismounts, and unties the horse. Turner dashes off, but Jacob Burleson, just upon reaching his own horse, is struck by a gunshot in the back of his head. In the chaos of the retreat, his body is left where it falls. The rangers and volunteers now retreat, roughly 3 miles back towards Wells Fort, before stopping momentarily to rest their horses. As the horses rest, the rangers and volunteers descend into a malaise of anger, self-doubt, confusion, and contention. It is well known among them all that, at this very moment, the body of their countryman and comrade, Jacob Burleson, is being subject to all manner of posthumous mutilations by the Comanche. In both an effort to add literal insult to injury, as well as to hamper the person in the next life, many tribes customarily practice disfiguring the bodies of their slain enemies. The accounts of those Texas settlers who had found the bodies of their friends and family had circulated amongst every community on the frontier for many years, even at this point in the 1830s. The prevailing opinion amongst the rangers and volunteers alike is that the Comanche must be re-engaged. But the matter of exactly how to go about this presents a conundrum for the bellicose and indignant men. In the midst of contentious discussions on how to further proceed, at around noon,
another force of 30 Rangers and volunteers, riding under the command of Captain Jacob Burleson's brother, Colonel Edward Burleson, arrives. Informed of the death of his brother, Colonel Burleson marshals the combined forces, roughly 84 men in total, and the party makes their way back towards Brushy Creek. They ride past the Brushy thicket, as well as the mutilated body of Jacob Burleson. Finding the thicket now empty, the Texians scan the surrounding countryside. They are met with yet another troubling, formidable sight. On the top of a large plateau near Brushy Creek, the Comanche and their allies have marshaled their forces into a large horseshoe formation, ready and waiting to receive the Rangers' forthcoming charge. Colonel Edward Burleson decides that he will divide his forces. He orders one of his officers, Captain Billingsley, to lead half of the men to attack the Comanche and their allies from below the plateau, while another contingent, led by Captain Rogers, will advance up a small ravine on the backside of the plateau. However, upon arriving at their tactical destinations, both officers find themselves roughly 50 yards from the entrenched Comanche position, with nothing but a coverless no-man's land in between the two parties. Now, an entrenched, prolonged battle drags out, with each side taking shots from their positions. One Comanche warrior in particular manages to kill 2 Texians and wound several others, acting as a masterful sniper with his single-shot rifle. Finally, young Winslow Turner locates the warrior's position from the gun smoke rising off of his weapon. Turner manages to climb a small tree, gain an advantage in position, and dispatch the sharpshooting Comanche with a carefully placed shot of his own. Finally, as the sun sets and night falls over the landscape, the Comanche and their allies retreat under cover of the night. As their enemies retreat, the Rangers and volunteers are met with the haunting, visceral cries of the Comanche themselves, mourning the loss of their own beloved friends and family who have fallen that day. In the aftermath of the fight, the brutal, inhumane nature of warfare on the Texas frontier is left all too apparent to the survivors present. The Rangers and volunteers now advance to the Comanche position, finding a singular survivor, one of the unnamed captured slaves taken by the Comanche the day prior. The man lies near death, with 9 arrows protruding from his body in various places. He has clearly been left for dead. But the man not only miraculously survives, he is able to give testimony to Colonel Burleson that the Comanche had carried off roughly 30 of their own dead. The Rangers and volunteers have, for their part, suffered 3 fatalities, including Jacob Burleson. One additional casualty, the Reverend James Gilleland, would die a little over a week later from the gunshot wound he incurred to his neck. In this world of cruelty, hardship, shifting alliances, and seemingly constant violence, the Battle of Brushy Creek provides a notable example of the multifaceted, cross-cultural, and cross-social nature of life on the Texas frontier in the 1830s. Even in the all-too-often macabre history of humanity, the tales of loss, tragedy, and survival in the history of Texas are notable in both scope and intensity. But the many tales of brutality, conflict, and cruelty that line the annals of Texas history are, for tonight, other stories for other times. Thank you again for joining us on this episode of History at the OK Corral. Be sure to click the like button, share this episode with a friend, and become a subscriber. Also, if you'd like to support our work and gain early access to episodes, as well as ad-free viewing, you can become a member of this channel by clicking on the join button below. And we'll see you next time on History at the OK Corral, home of history's greatest shootouts and showdowns.